Good evening and welcome to the Raymond B. White Auditorium on the campus of the Barstow School. For our crowd here this evening, as well as for our crowd online, we have a real treat in store. My name is Shane Foster, and on behalf of the Barstow community, it is my honor to introduce our speaker series. Tonight, we will get to listen to an expert on Twain. Jared Roark researches crime, punishment, and gender performance in 19th century American literature and culture, specifically in the works of Mark Twain. He earned a PhD in this field in the spring of 2013. Jared has taught at the University of Missouri-Kansas City, the Art Institute of Kansas City, and is beginning his 8th year at the Barstow School. During his time at Barstow, Jared has presented research at national and international conferences, including the American Literature Association Annual Conference, the Mark Twain Conference in Hannibal, Missouri, the Missouri Conference on History, the Pop Culture Association, American Culture Association National Conference, and most recently at the 7th International Conference on the State of Mark Twain Studies. His work has been published in New Letters Literary Magazine, Directions, Proceedings, The Image of the Outlaw in Literature, Media and Society, and the Mark Twain Annual. A collaborative chapter titled Teaching Transatlantic Sensations will appear next year in the book, Teaching Transathleticism. Currently, Jared is revising a book manuscript, a process that influenced the 5 lectures in this series. Tonight, we are about to hear Seasons in the Life and Works of a Missourian in the Territory. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Jared Roark.
Thank you, Shane, for that warm introduction. I also want to thank Sean Holmes and the BTVN staff for being here tonight to film this. Also, to Todd Race, Kelly Crockett, Ron Johnson, Bob Kohler, and Liz Bartow, thank you for your help and support during this series. And thank you all for coming out, missing part of Game 6 and getting a little wet on the way in. I cut myself shaving this morning, and the last 2 Twain lectures I've given, I've cut myself just before. So I'm thinking those went okay, so if this one goes all right, I might continue to cut myself intentionally on my face after tonight. I think it goes very well with the lecture I have in store for you, which Mr. Foster introduced the series, Mark Twain, Seasons in the Life and Work of a Missourian in the Territory. Because most of us know Twain as the boy from Missouri and the man who donned a white suit, I think an alternate title could be The Mark Twain You Don't Know, How Samuel Clemens's ambition, failure, success created the one you do know. Nothing in the world affords a newspaper reporter so much satisfaction as gathering up the details of a bloody and mysterious murder and writing them up with aggravated circumstantiality. He takes a living delight in this labor of love. It's from Mark Twain's The Killing of Julius Caesar, localized in 1865, which is a fictionalized account of the killing of Caesar as if being told by a 19th century newspaper reporter. Later, Twain would have a very different experience. The muzzle of the pistol might have felt cool against his flesh, but Samuel Clemens was not thinking about the pistol's steel or the circular character printed on the page of his head. He was pondering his failure. The 29-year-old Samuel Clemens sat alone in the darkness of his rented crib in San Francisco and later thought, I wasn't man enough to pull the trigger. Though he had recently read the editor of the New York Round Table's praise for the foremost among the married gentlemen of the California press, who signs himself Mark Twain, published on September 9, 1865, Clemens was in debt. The young journalist was overworked and underpaid, depressed, and wanted earthly rewards. The New York editor seemed to offer Clemens a prediction and a warning. If he will husband his resources and not kill with overwork the mental goose that has given us these golden eggs, he may one day take rank among the brightest of our wits. Clemens both feared being overworked and dreamed of being famous. In an October 1865 letter to his brother and sister-in-law, Clemens admitted that he had been sighing after vain possibilities and striving for a fame, though he had not succeeded. Now, he even questioned his faith. He writes that he had a religion, but you will call it blasphemy. It is there that there is a God for the rich man, but none for the poor. He closes this letter to his brother with a thought that led him to put a pistol to his head. If I do not get out of debt in 3 months, pistols are poison for me. Exit me. There's a text for a sermon on self-murder. Proceed. In November, his first story, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, was published in the New York Saturday Press, a weekly literary newspaper. The paper had become well known for publishing work by established and newer American and British writers such as Walt Whitman, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Horatio Alger Jr., Charles Dickens, and William Dean Howells. A few months later, in March 1866, Clemens sailed to the Sandwich Islands, which is what we now call Hawaii, for a 5-month excursion as a correspondent for the Virginia City Union. This success and others that year allowed Twain to leave the West and seek national fame rather than the regional kind in New York. The transition permitted the gentleman of the California press, born Samuel Clemens and reinvented as Mark Twain, to publish his sensational writing that reflected his criticisms of crime, criminals, and violence for a broader audience. The success that Twain had enjoyed in Nevada, California, and the entire West, however, was vast, important, and based on his use of humor for certain, but also on his reports on crime with a discourse of violence. When Clemens dented his head with a pistol near the end of 1865, he had failed in the mines, but he had already gained much popularity for crafting combinations of sensational, violent, satirical, and humorous journalism, while simultaneously reflecting his personal anxieties about crime, power, and especially gender. After all, he admitted in that letter that he was not man enough to pull the trigger and cause self-murder. Though this admission to his family in a letter is the only evidence to support Clemens's claim that he contemplated suicide, the claim, not the event, bears the greater significance. For even if the event never occurred, Clemens still thought that reporting with sensational language to his family the disaster of his external set of circumstances, coupled with an emotional response to them, would appeal to his readers, even if they numbered only 2. Over the next few years, Clemens did publish in daily papers, such as the New York Herald or the New York Tribune, founded by Horace Greeley in 1841, and even papers in San Francisco, periodicals such as the Californian and the Alta California. On March 6, 1866, Clemens began a 5-month trip to the Sandwich Islands that were spawned by his travel letters, which eventually totaled 25. Clemens then moved to New York in 1867. In New York, he made connections with influential editors such as Clapp and Reed, a couple of people I won't get into tonight, and moved up the periodical hierarchy that had begun in the West and continued in the East. Not inconsequentially, Clemens also found love and a new life in New York. Here he met his friend Charlie's sister, Olivia Langdon, in 1867, and eventually married her in 1870. After 1871, he divided his time among Buffalo, Hartford, Elmira, New York City, and a farm named Quarry Farm outside of Elmira, and his travels around the globe. In 1872, Mark Twain published Roughing It, and the next year, The Gilded Age. These publications, beginning with Virginia City's territorial enterprise between 1862 and 73, provide the framework of the bulk of this lecture series. This particular lecture offers a journalistic view of Clemens's views about crime and justice in Nevada Territory in California and New York just after he left the West, within the historical and literary timeline in his life, beginning in 1862 and ending in 1871. The climax of this timeline, the moment when he considered suicide, as related in the letter to his brother and sister-in-law in 1865, begins this study, for it offers a view of Clemens on a precipice. At that moment, he did not know if he would fail or succeed as a writer. He only knew that he had left home to become something greater than he was born. By beginning here at the climax of the timeline, and then starting at the beginning, we see 3 years of literary ambitions and experiments building toward this moment. After 65, we see the fruition of these ambitions that Clemens feared would not come. My goal is to show the responses to such violence, written by Samuel Clemens and later Mark Twain, as philosophic observation, which allowed him indeed to achieve these great ambitions. Though Clemens had always wanted to deliver meaning to people, he had not always wanted to be a writer. He initially had two powerful ambitions: to become a riverboat pilot, which he did become in 1859, and a preacher, which he did not become. Thank goodness for us. So then the same letter he wrote to Orion and Molly about committing self-murder in 1865 provides an additional aspect on this timeline's climax: Samuel Clemens' ambitions. He explains that rather having a call to preach the gospel, he has one to write literature of a low order, which he hopes will excite the laughter of God's creatures. This view of a writer, then, is similar to the role of a preacher. Both deliver meaning to people and capture their attention. Though delivering God's message might have been a more powerful ambition, according to Twain, delivering a moral philosophy, indeed, such judgments about violent men and their crimes also satisfied a high ambition for Twain. This timeline then tracks Clemens' violent and humorous writing along a spectrum of writing, both journalistic and fictional, often tracing how his writing was received in the press and how it shifted to gain a broader national attention and to gain Mark Twain even transatlantic fame. I want to show a couple of images here. This is a view of Samuel Clemens in 1863. He was only 27 years old, and this image of Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, might not even be recognizable to most of us. Most of us probably envision Mark Twain more like this. After he'd become a literary giant, his hair turned white, and he affected the white suit and smoked cigars and loved cats and whiskey. However, it's not so difficult to actually disrupt a stable view of someone we know and love so easily. Mark Twain is his images, in fact, are part of this project, 19th century images being colorized, especially ones related to the Civil War, to try to give a new dimension, a new perspective to such images. It almost seems creepy in some way to see the rosiness on Twain's cheeks, almost like he's been made up for a camera. So then my hope tonight is to sort of disrupt your stable view of Twain in that white suit. In fact, murder made Mark Twain. Most people don't think of him that way. Desperados, lynch mobs, failed and drunk husbands, clients of prostitutes, judges, and even the gallows provided Twain the bloody and mysterious murders he transformed into literary accounts that sold newspapers in the West. When Samuel Clemens left Missouri by overland stagecoach with his older brother Orion on July 26, 1861, just 5 days after the first Battle of Bull Run near Manassas, Virginia, he could not have known that the page of his Western notoriety would be written in the blood of criminals and their victims. The color of hard silver originally appealed to Clemens more than did viscous red. Though Clemens did not find fortunes in the silver mines of Nevada Territory as he had hoped, he did find fame, but not until after February 1863, and as a journalist, where he first signed his name, Mark Twain, the pseudonym that became the man. In the West, he continually reported with both judgment and humor on violence in newspapers and letters, and eventually, after he left the West, in books. Even if Clemens, like other Western immigrants, did not welcome the presence of actual violence in his daily life, he certainly enjoyed reading about murder and entertaining his readers with inventive ways to describe literary murders. He once wrote humorously to his mother that he had greedily saved a letter from her to read at the end of the day, for it contained details of a murder in his home state, Missouri. His paragraph ends with a simple statement about his own taste in reading that he must have known was true for most readers of periodicals and sensational fiction of the 1860s. I like murders, especially when I can read them in bed and smoke. Sounds a little like us with CSI. The periodical marketplace of the 1860s and even of antebellum America depended on the cheap printing, factual reporting, humor writing, and fiction, even sentimental narratives. During this period, Clemens wrote for a variety of periodicals, some which were dailies, some weeklies, some literary, some disposable. In the 1860s, when he reported for these periodicals, he started to gain notoriety for writing about the happenings in the territorial government. This is probably because of his connection with his brother Orion, who happened to be the secretary of the territorial governor, which is why they even traveled west in the first place. As he began to garner attention from local editors for his irreverence with the local government reporting, he continued to live in Virginia City, Nevada, but contributed to California papers as well. At the time, California really controlled Nevada, which was a territory and not a state. So as California went, so did Nevada. Within a couple of months in the spring of 1864, Clemens moved to San Francisco, where he became a full-time reporter for The Call until October of 1864. Between 64 and 67, Clemens continued to contribute to all these papers, but this was a period when he experienced a personal crisis and put the gun to his head. But he knew murder attracted readers. Sensation sold. Even before becoming Twain, Clemens had learned early on as a journalist in Nevada territory that reports about fistfights or burglaries might have been necessary to print in the newspaper, but they did not allow him to exert his creative literary forces that interested him and ultimately his readers. In Free Fight, a story printed in 1863 in the Territorial Enterprise, Clemens describes a disappointing brawl in the city. A beautiful and ably conducted free fight, came off in C Street yesterday afternoon, but as nobody was killed or mortally wounded in a manner sufficiently fatal to cause death, no particular interest attaches to the matter, and we shall not publish the details. We pine for murder. These fistfights are of no consequence to anybody. Here, Clemens' ironic voice slithers among the prose, biting, hissing at the harmlessness of a fistfight when compared with a murder. And yet, he releases enough venom to deliver the social critique. Because Clemens was in the process of crafting for himself a persona of literary desperado in the West, his language delivers both sensation and social satire. In fact, his persona was not only a literary desperado, but also his name, Mark Twain, became famous for its relationship to bad men, crime, violence, and the regional reception of these infamous men. But as the 1860s closed and the new decade opened, Twain became a resident of New York, settling with his wife Olivia in Elmira, where his father-in-law lived. Here, he finally witnessed the fruits of his Western ambitions, which he had planted but harvested only inchoate success. In New York, he nurtured his Western voice so that national and international readers might consider cultural practices and even disagree with ones as controversial as execution. Such a method had worked in the West, after all, when Twain wrote about murders. In 1871, as Mark Twain finished revising Roughing It in Elmira, New York, he became fascinated with the corruption of New York Supreme Court cases. One death penalty case in particular attracted Twain's ire. Edward Howard Ruloff, convicted burglar and murderer, appeared before the New York Supreme Court, where testimonies, according to their journalist, revealed his 30 years of crime, including the murder of his own wife and child, all of which was widely reported in the press. In addition to the sensational printed accounts of his crimes, newspapers printed items about the paradoxical nature of Ruloff, a criminal and a scholar. Notice how he's depicted in this image. He's in a jail cell, and yet he's writing, he's studying their books about. And this was one of the reasons that Twain thought that he did not deserve to die, not because he didn't commit murder, but because he might be useful. Though he lacked professional qualifications, Ruloff practiced law, medicine, and philology, which newspapers and Twain noted as important considerations when sentencing a person to death. Perhaps a criminal could serve his community if he were qualified in such things as law, medicine, and linguistics, rather than be executed and serve no one. On April 29th, Mark Twain wrote a satirical letter in the vein of his early sensational writing, questioning the justice enacted by a group of fallible humans. In the West, he was skeptical of lynch mobs, juries, any group of people. In New York, he doubted the ability of the juries to be just. Twain included an explanatory letter with the April letter to Whitelaw Reid, the then editor of the New York Tribune, commenting on the injustice in the courts and Ruloff's impending execution that would deprive a community of such a man's service. According to Twain, "Sir, I believe in capital punishment. I believe that when a murder has been done, it should be answered for with blood. The fact that the death law is rendered almost inoperative by its very severity does not alter my belief in its righteousness." Some people mistook this irony as sincerity. Twain then continued to explain further to avoid any miscommunication or interpretation. In the opening of the paragraph, Twain's sarcasm about the uselessness and ineffectiveness of capital punishment signals the satirical nature of the letter, a response which was, in fact, an opinion of Roark published in that same paper, the Tribune, which Twain hoped Reed would then publish and that New Yorkers would read. He continues with the explanation of the purpose of this letter. "I am not sorry that Roark is to be hanged, but I am sincerely sorry that he himself has made it necessary that his vast capabilities for usefulness should be lost to this world. In this, mine and the public's is a common regret. What miracles this murderer might have wrought, and what luster he might have shed upon his country, if he had not put a forfeit upon his life so foolishly. But what if the law could be satisfied, and the gifted criminal still be saved? If a life be offered on the gallows to atone for the murder of Roark, will that suffice? If so, I will instantly bring forward a man who, in the interest of learning and science, will take Roark's crime upon himself and submit to be hanged in Roark's place. I can and will do this thing, and I propose this matter, and I make this offer in good faith. You know me and my address." That's when he throws down the mic and walks away, right? Take that. Everybody knows that what Twain is saying here is not, in fact, that he's going to be a Messiah or a sacrifice for this murder, but that it should be offered because Roark is, in fact, useful. As if the reporting of Roark's crimes, intellect, and sentencing were not sensational enough, in this passage, Twain has created an alternate resolution. He has suggested that he take the place of a murderer, which was a recent plot line in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, when Sidney Carton sacrificed his own life to save Charles Darnay. In fact, the Tribune published Twain's satirical letter on May 3rd, 1871, under the title, "A Substitute for Roark, Have We a Sidney Carton Among Us?" Public executions birth conversations, as do murders, but so does heroism. Twain has offered to supply the state of New York with a life to atone for the murder Roark did, an actual Charles Darnay, perhaps even Twain himself. Twain's accompanying letter to Reed explains his bully article and what he hopes it will accomplish. "I have written this thing for an object, which is to make people talk about and look at and presently entertain the idea of commuting Roark's sentence. The last paragraph, as magnificently absurd as it is what I depend on to start the talk at every breakfast table in the land. If the talk gets started once, that is sufficient. They'll all talk. Pretty soon, and then the acting will come easily and naturally." Even before Twain immigrated to Nevada, as a secretary for his brother Orion, newly appointed secretary for the governor, Twain was intrigued with law and its application, just and unjust. He had grown up around law. His father, John Marshall Clemens, had practiced law in Tennessee before moving the family to Florida, Missouri. Here, Clemens became a judge of the Monroe County Court. A year later, in 1839, the Clemens family moved to Hannibal, where Judge Clemens served as justice of the peace. Still, Twain's view is more complicated than what he was raised to understand, for he offers conflicting views about execution in his early writing. Twain and his personas and narrators hoped to entertain, but with this brand of sensationalism, he hoped to make people talk, so they will act, a desire he expressed in the letter I just read. Though Twain openly condemned capital punishment in 1871, his Western literature often condones frontier justice, including gunfights, duels, which he was a part of once. He fled his duel, actually, and went to San Francisco for a party instead. Not very brave, but he did survive it. In a letter to the Tribune, Twain argues that Roark should not be executed, though he should be imprisoned, because he possesses one of the most marvelous intellects that any age has produced. In other words, Roark is valuable. In various stages of life and career, Twain respected courageous men who subverted social conventions and offered social value, even if these men were flawed and violent, even if they were murderers. Though Twain used Ruloff as a symbol for a useful human and as a victim of a useless punishment, Twain built on this utilitarian argument as he crafted the episodes that contain the notorious Jack A. Slade in his travel narrative, Roughing It. Slade was bold and violent, but he was particularly masculine and Western. According to Twain's narrator in Roughing It, in the West, a useful man must also perform manliness, which is one aspect of the desperado persona which Twain himself wanted to become a part of. This is an image, as you can see, from the 1899 edition of Roughing It, and the man in the middle with his back to us is Twain, and the man on the left is Slade. Slade was a murderer, but he captured Samuel Clemens' admiration and fear sometime during Twain's migration to Nevada in 1861, and held it at least until he finished Roughing It in 1871. According to the work's narrator, a constructed persona of Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens, or however we want to view this man, Slade is a, quote, man whose heart and hands and soul were steeped in the blood of offenders against his dignity, a man who awfully avenged his injuries, affronts, insults, or slights of whatever kind, on the spot if he could, years later, afterward, if lack of earlier opportunity compelled it. This ruthlessness made Slade a feared man, but also a respected one. For this reason, Twain advances this utilitarian argument for the salvation of Slade and notes that Slade is the most dangerous and valuable citizen that inhabited the savage fastness of the mountains. Such a statement sounds similar to the kind that Twain made about Ruloff. Twain's narrator in Roughing It portrays Slade as friendly, gentle-spoken, pleasant, which is a surprising combination considering the man was a murderer who apparently killed 26 men. And yet Slade is recognizable as human, a man, when he weeps at the gallows where vigilantes summarily hanged him. In these scenes, Twain tries to redeem Slade. In September 1870, while working on the 2 chapters that contain the stories of Slade and Roughing It, Clemens wrote a letter to the postmaster of Virginia City, Idaho Territory, which would later become Montana, and requested any newspaper articles or notices of Slade's crimes or executions that might have survived. Clemens wanted to use this material to fill out the details of Slade's life. Clemens explains to the postmaster that he hopes to redeem Slade's reputation. Dear sir, 4 or 5 years ago, a righteous vigilance committee in your city hanged a casual acquaintance of mine named Slade. I crossed the plains of the overland stage in an overland stage 10 years ago, and I took breakfast with him and survived. Now I am writing a book, and I thought I would just rescue my friend from oblivion and set a sympathetic public to weeping for him. The object of this letter is to beg of you to ask someone connected with your city papers to send me a Virginia City newspaper of that day if it can be done without mutilating a file. Though Twain might have tried to redeem Slade in literature, Slade was, in fact, hanged by a vigilance committee on March 10, 1864, less than 3 years after Clemens had first met and dined with Slade on his journey to Nevada Territory with Orion. Edward Howard Ruloff, the scholar whom Twain believed could better serve society through his research and scholarship from inside a prison cell, was legally hanged a decade later. Problems exist with stating that Mark Twain wrote in defense of the individual rights of man or rallied against the legal and political systems that suppress these rights, or specifically that Twain deplored the death penalty and wrote articles that influenced citizens and politicians to fight for the abolition of the death penalty. These statements are true, but Clemens was not a political activist in the 1860s when he covered the events in Nevada Territory and California. Another problem is that Twain did not always support the civil liberties or right against the death penalty. For example, in 1868, he celebrated the hanging of John Million for the murder of the famous Virginia City prostitute Julia Bulett, which will actually be a part of the next lecture in December. Additionally, 2 unpublished notes exist that complicate my arguments and allow us to view Clemens' humor, his disdain for one man who did in fact fight for the abolition of the death penalty, and Clemens' nearly throwaway view of capital punishment. Marvin Henry Beauvais wrote 2 letters to Mark Twain, both describing Beauvais' view about criminal justice. Beauvais, a Wisconsin farmer and one-term senator, in 1853 introduced and helped pass legislation in Wisconsin that abolished the death penalty. In his first letter, dated April 7, 1875, Beauvais asked for Mark Twain's help to promote Beauvais' lectures and denounce capital punishment. Clemens did not respond to that letter, nor did he help Beauvais advance the abolition of capital punishment in the way that Beauvais had requested. Instead, Clemens saved the letter and the envelope, which you see here. On the outside of the envelope, Clemens wrote, and I'll turn it upside down so you can see it, "From some bore who wants to destroy the death penalty, with an eye to his own future, doubtless." 10 months later, apparently, Beauvais thought he might persuade Mark Twain once again to respond and petition Twain for his help. On February 10th, 1876, Beauvais wrote a second letter. And this one, Beauvais wrote, "I shall be glad to have you help a little if you feel inclined." And once again, Clemens did not respond. He probably huffed or smirked or smoked a cigar and then wrote on the envelope. This one's more difficult to read. It's in pencil on the left-hand side if you're interested, but you can see the caption. "From that inextinguishable deadbeat who has infested legislatures for 20 years trying to put an end to capital punishment, no answer." Twain's transition from Western humorist, journalist, and writer of sensational news items to a New York bohemian marked his transition from a regional reporter to a book-length writer of national literary merit and fame. By 1871, when he tried to save Rudolph's life, Clemens' time in the West had ended. Though the West remained and continued to influence his writing, he would never again report on a daily basis on Western culture, the violence contained within it, for these same newspapers. He would use his literary style as a bad man who advanced his philosophic observations to critique culture and simultaneously attract readers, even women, all because he had an ambition to leave home and dedicate himself to success even after knowing great failure. In the next lecture, we will see how women influenced the life and writing of Samuel Clemens, an experience that began during his time in the West and developed traction when his wife challenged him during a Christmas dinner in 1872. Thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope to see you in December or one of the other lectures. The December lecture, however, will also showcase Mr. Luce, who will help me investigate some visual images to represent some of the content that I will be talking about from a literary perspective. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it. If any of you have any questions, I promised I would keep this around 30 minutes, and it was just a little over with our delay. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Mr. Foster has a microphone there, if you feel so inclined.
The period that he was in San Francisco that you talked about in the lecture, is that the period he coined the famous saying about the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco?
It would be had he said that. Yeah. Yeah, we were talking the other day at the lunch table. Mark Twain, this was on NPR. One of my colleagues was asking me if I had been listening to this. Bob, that was you, right? Yeah. Bob asked me if I'd been listening to this, and I hadn't been. And we didn't talk about that particular quote, but Mark Twain, Winston Churchill, a couple of misquoted people. And it makes sense because they said so many things about so many different ideas and events and culture. And when you think about Twain's lifespan, 1835 to 1910, he really saw a pre-modern period burst into a modern world. And though he never said the coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco, he said something very similar about Paris, in fact. But he was talking about the rain in Paris. He found Paris very dreary and cold. But yeah, that's oft attributed to, in fact, on a plane ride back from doing research at Berkeley a couple of years ago, a guy sitting next to me on the plane saw me writing in my notes. And he was flying from San Francisco to Kansas City. And he said, well, have you ever been to San Francisco, the Bay Area before? And I said, yeah, I've been a couple of times. I love it here. He said, well, I see you're a Twain enthusiast. Have you heard this one? And I said, yeah, I have heard it. And he's like, yeah, we just love Twain in San Francisco. I didn't have the heart to tell him that quote was not, accurate. But you know what? That's okay. I mean, who wants to be that person, It's all right. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
He chased a business venture through probably the last 30, 40 years of his life. Did that creep into his writing at all?
Oh, yeah. My research, this project, this larger research project, is really about his time in the West and his time just after it. But you're talking about the type compositor, and it was really a failed enterprise. His wife's family had money, his didn't. And the money that he gained from lectures and publications, he sunk most of that into these inventions. So that's in the later part of his career. The later part of his career, though, was troubled with poor financial decisions, but also because his children were dying and then his wife died. He had 4 children. His son died at 19 months. 2 of his daughters died in his lifetime, one from drowning in the bathtub on Christmas Eve from an epileptic fit, and the other from spinal meningitis. And so not only was he failing financially toward the end of his life, but he was seeing a real degradation in his family too. Those years in his life were very dark. His initial years had all this kind of hope, and even though he's talking about failure, self-murder, there's still this kind of tongue-in-cheek aspect to it. And he's in his 20s, he sort of feels invincible in some ways. But later in life, he didn't really. It really crushed him when his daughters and his wife died, yeah. And that financial drain, he was able to gain quite a bit of his not really his fortunes back, but enough to become stable again. He got to charge a lot for his lectures. Based on the way we think about a lecture circuit now, he would have been able to charge $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 in our economy for some of his lectures. He was that popular. He was probably the most popular living American at that time. For that reason, Tesla asked him to help him display AC current in 1894 to compete against Edison's DC current, So, yeah, those are dark years for him. But financial disruptions, that was only one cause of that, yeah.
I have a question about the Civil War. It occurs to me that you were saying he and his brother went west right at the time when the Civil War was beginning. Did young men go west to avoid serving in the Civil War? And there wasn't a draft back then. Can you talk a little bit about the Civil War and any role that it played in his life or writing?
Sure, yeah. In 1859, he became a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi, which, if you remember, he'd always wanted to be a riverboat pilot. He grew up on the river. But when the Civil War really started to hit, the military closed down all of the civilian river traffic, so he was basically out of a job. He and some of his buddies near Hannibal joined a militia for the Confederacy in Missouri, fought for the South for about a week, and he said this wasn't for him. It's really uncomfortable, it's unpleasant, there's rain, he doesn't really get to eat 3 meals a day, people want to shoot at him. He didn't really welcome that. You draw this parallel to being a war deserter, and in fact, that's been one of the things in Twain studies that some of the older generation in Twain studies have been really likely to preserve, especially Southerners. But it was very common for young men to head west. West was supposed to be this place of rejuvenation, a place of opportunity. It was often called the New Prairie Eden. It was supposed to be a utopia, not only for the discovery of silver and gold, silver in 1859, gold in 1848 in California, but also because one could escape. So when he, gets to ride along with his older brother Orion as his personal secretary, because his brother was the secretary to the governor of this territory in Nevada, this large space, he was quite thrilled because what he really wanted to do out there was not get shot at and to make it rich in the silver mines. He wrote about this, if you're interested, he wrote about this war service in a short story, a fictionalized account of this. It's titled, A Brief History of My Campaign That Failed, something along those lines. But yeah, he wrote it years later, recalling those events. But yeah, it was a very common event for young men to go west, for both Northerners and Southerners, and people along the border states in Kansas and Missouri as well. Not so much in Kansas, but in Missouri, definitely. Yeah, did that answer your question? Okay, great, yeah.
Do you know any of the details of the duel?
Yeah, he, it seems so cowardly to say this stuff out loud, but it was like an early Facebook, Twitter war. And I'm not exaggerating. He got into a literary argument with a fellow journalist at a rival newspaper on staff in Virginia City. Virginia City, it doesn't seem like it would be a thing, but Virginia City, Nevada Territory, was this really growing, booming, cosmopolitan mining town. Immigrants from all around the world came there to both work in the silver mines and to sell goods. It was a place. So they actually had some very, very successful newspaper writing in that town. Anyway, he got in this literary duel with somebody on the newspaper called The Union, and it became so heated that the opposing journalist challenged him to a duel, which wasn't an everyday occurrence in the 19th century, but there's quite a bit of it in the 19th century, especially in the West. Twain initially accepted, and then all of his friends are like, whoa, man, you already deserted the war. You're not much of a fighter. You hang out at the saloon over there on D Street more frequently than holding guns. Have you really thought this through? So he fled to New York with his buddy, to San Francisco, with his buddy, where they stayed in this hotel for a while, basically just partying and cutting up, and they got kicked out for a while, and then he started writing for a San Francisco paper, and he kind of was able to draw himself away from sort of the rougher Virginia City, Nevada crowd. So yeah, I don't know that it was so pusillanimous as it just was self-protecting, That's not to justify Twitter or Facebook wars, young ones. Don't do that.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
all of you being here this evening. We are going to continue the evening with some refreshments outside, and I'm sure that Dr. Roark would entertain some more questions out there. Thank you so much for coming.